I'm Brett Baer.
I'm Maria Bartiromo.
I'm Brian Kilmeade, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, September 8th, 2021. I'm Lisa Brady. Democrats plan a busy September on Capitol Hill, but some Republicans say not so fast.
They should do nothing until we do a thorough investigation of whatever happened in Afghanistan.
We speak with Florida Senator Rick Scott.
I'm Dave Anthony. COVID has been surging, back to levels at its winter peak, because of a variant even more contagious than first thought.
And it's really almost impossible to avoid it. The old principles of herd immunity don't apply to Delta. Delta's been a game changer. And so that's why I'd encourage everybody who does not have immunity to go out and get a vaccine dose.
And I'm Jimmy Fallon. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
President Biden is sounding the alarm about climate change.
We're living through it now. We don't have any more time.
Spending much of Tuesday touring more storm damage from Hurricane Ida, this time focusing on a more extreme hit to the Northeast than many expected.
These waves crashed through the streets here, testing the aging infrastructure and taking lives. More lives were taken here than down in Louisiana.
He met with the governors of New York and New Jersey and walked through heavily damaged neighborhoods, hugging some homeowners, but also facing a few hecklers.
I give my life for this country. You guys should be ashamed of yourselves.
Supporters of former President Trump calling President Biden despicable for leaving Americans behind in Afghanistan, as the White House and State Department pledge to continue diplomatic efforts to get more people out. White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki.
We're in touch with American citizens. We're working to get them out. There are 4 who were able to depart over land. Our Secretary of State is in Qatar right now working on a range of options, including getting flights up and operational and going.
Some Democrats in Congress also expressing frustration and concern about the fate of would-be evacuees. Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal suggests accountability will be needed for what he calls inexcusable bureaucratic red tape that stranded so many of our Afghan allies. But many Democrats, including the president, have been turning attention back to his domestic agenda, with storm damage as the backdrop, arguing it's further evidence that infrastructure investments are needed, including the $3.5 trillion human infrastructure bill that Democrats hope to push through with a simple majority, possibly as a condition of passing a smaller package of more traditional infrastructure plans.
They should do nothing until we do a thorough investigation of whatever happened in Afghanistan. 13 Americans died because of the failure of Joe Biden.
Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott.
We need to know exactly how the decisions were made. In Congress, we need to stop wasting money. The so-called infrastructure bill had less than half of it had anything to do with infrastructure. It had at least $250 billion of deficit spending in one bill. One bill, over $250 billion increase to our debt. Then after that, let's remember, this is just a liberal wish list that is going to raise everybody's taxes. They're going to do everything they can to fundamentally make people dependent on government, which is not how this country was created.
Have you had any response to from either, Senate Majority Leader Schumer or House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to your calls for an investigation of Afghanistan? I mean, I know some committees do plan to hold hearings, but have you heard a response from Democratic leadership?
No. Pelosi and Schumer, they won't call out the Biden administration because they know it would look bad for Democrats. So no, they've not said anything. They are all in bankrupting this country. You know, their proposal is going to take us to $45 trillion of debt. I mean, this makes no sense, and it's causing inflation, which hurts our poorest families. So I'm going to do everything I can to stop wasteful spending.
It's one thing to argue against the big picture, though, trillions in new spending. Is it harder when the fine print involves things that some struggling families might need, like help with childcare and elder care?
I'm all in for helping people that need help. Absolutely. Let's pass things that make sense. I am a fiduciary for all the taxpayers of Florida, and I want to help people that need help, but I'm not going to go waste their money because guess what? Somebody has to pay it back, And in the meantime, this reckless spending is doing exactly what I said it was going to do. It's caused inflation. Look at gas prices up. Food prices are up. I mean, the Biden Democrat plan is killing our economy and making it difficult for the poorest families to get ahead. I grew up in public housing as a single mom. I know what it's like to struggle to get ahead, and that's exactly what they're doing to families like mine growing up.
Since the larger bill isn't actually written yet, is there a chance that the concerns of a moderate Democrat, namely West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, could influence that process enough to get any Republicans on board?
I would be shocked. I mean, let's remember this 3.5, which is really $5.5 trillion, which takes our debt to $45 trillion, is led by Bernie Sanders. And the Democrats say they're only going to tax the rich. They can't tax the rich enough to pay for all the things that they want to do. So I'll be shocked if they can get one Republican to support this wasteful spending. You know, my goal is let's do good things, but let's do it in a fiscally responsible manner. Take infrastructure. I spent $85 billion in my 8 years as governor on roads, bridges, airports, and seaports. I believe in it. But I also cut taxes 100 times and it paid off a third of the state debt. You can do all of these things if you want to act responsibly.
Just to play devil's advocate for a minute, the president obviously argues that his, economic plans are working. And he says there's been, 7 straight months of job growth, even though the growth in August wasn't what he had hoped to see. And that these are investments we have to make, for the future. Are you concerned at all that any of what he says could at least be resonating, with the American people? Are you feeling any pressure from constituents to get on board with any of these things?
What I hear from Floridians is they're scared to death of Joe Biden and the Democrats spending because they know it's going to result in tax increases. They're furious over how Joe Biden handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan. They're just furious. And they're furious that people will be paid more not to work than to work. The Biden agenda of energy dependency, open borders, closed schools is not what Americans want.
I know you have described the president as being out to lunch and have said actually that he should be removed from office. Have you had any support in Washington, among Republicans at least, for that line of thinking?
What I've been clear about is if you look at his open border policies, if you look at the disaster withdrawal from Afghanistan, the 13 members of armed services that should never have lost their life. What I've said is the people that are closest to Joe Biden, his cabinet, have a fiduciary duty to look and say to themselves, is Joe Biden fit to lead as commander-in-chief?
I saw that you tweeted Monday after a story in the Daily Mail about the Taliban executing a pregnant police officer in front of her children. And you wrote that they're showing us they're an evil, murderous gang of terrorists. What jumped out at me was one of the responses to that tweet asking you, wasn't it President Trump who signed a deal with them? Are you disappointed in any way that President Trump did negotiate and make a withdrawal deal with the Taliban?
I think it was clear we should not be in further wars. I think it's clear that, it made sense to leave Afghanistan, but no one thought that we would leave Afghanistan where we left American citizens and allies behind in a lurch. I believe that it was time to leave, but you don't leave like this.
The president seems to be, sticking with his argument that really everybody was on the same page in his administration about the way this was done. For instance, the decision to close Bagram first and focus efforts in Kabul. What about his argument that his quote unquote real choice was either to get out or send in more troops? In other words, it wouldn't have been possible to just go ahead and stay with the contingent of 2,500 or to keep Bagram open for the evacuation without surging troops then.
When you're the commander-in-chief, which he is, the buck stops with you. You have to make the decision with all the information you get from everybody, right? He made the decision that ended up in a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, where we lost lives that we shouldn't have lost, where we left Americans behind that we've never done before. He made those calls. So we lost 13 people that should not be dead right now because of Joe Biden's foolish actions.
What is the mood in Washington right now? Has it changed because of this chaotic exit from Afghanistan? Has that changed the mood on Capitol Hill, the atmosphere?
Absolutely. People are furious. I think the Democrats are embarrassed of what Biden did. I think it's going to be very difficult for him to get much else done because you can't trust the guy. I mean, do you want to serve a commander-in-chief that doesn't use the military intelligence information to keep you safe? And that's what's scaring the living daylights out of people right now.
How does that affect the chance of getting anything done? I mean, whether, the public is sitting back and agreeing with you and saying, this is horrible, what happened, and it kind of does overshadow the conversation, at least for the moment. How does this affect the chances of Congress being able to do anything?
Well, I've been up there 2.5 years, and it's too bad that you can't get things done right now. But the reason is that Democrats have this liberal wish list that they are just hell-bent on getting done. You could do infrastructure. I'm all in for infrastructure, but I'm not going to go waste money and run deficits to do it. We ought to be helping the families that need help right now. But we don't have to spend $5.5 trillion to do that. The American public was never on board for these things. The American public didn't vote to keep our border open. They didn't vote to close our schools, make us energy dependent. They didn't vote for leaving Afghanistan, where we leave our citizens and our allies at risk. That was never what they voted for last November. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the Democrats to get things done because what they're talking about has never been something that the American public bought into.
So just on the two types of infrastructure packages, is it possible for the smaller one, the bipartisan one, to win final passage if that larger bill ends up stalling? For instance, if there isn't, the full contingent of Democrats willing to support it in its current form, is that bigger bill going to end up stopping the smaller bill? Or do you think there's a chance that Democrats will let one go without the other?
I'll be surprised. Nancy Pelosi has been clear that she's not going to let that happen. But I oppose both of them because it's a waste of money. We should do infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, and seaports, and do it in a fiscally responsible manner. We can't. That's not what they're doing. So my goal is that neither of these things pass because you're not spending in a fiduciary manner. I represent the citizens of my state. This is not a good use of their money.
Just to ask one quick follow-up then on that bipartisan, quote-unquote, bipartisan infrastructure bill, since there are some Republicans who support it, what would you like to see in place of it, in place of that smaller bill?
Let's do a bill that has our federal government investing in roads, bridges, airports, and seaports, okay, in places where the federal government has a responsibility. And in the meantime, let's figure out how we can reduce taxes to grow this economy, how we can reduce regulation to grow this economy, how we can stake every dollar of federal spending and get a return for the tax breaks, their money.
Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott, thank you very, very much for your time.
Thanks, Lisa. Have a good day.
This is Jimmy Fallon with your Fox News commentary coming up.
We've now topped 40 million COVID cases across America since the pandemic started, as infections surge again back to levels not seen since January when it peaked. We've had over 1 million cases a week, 3 weeks in a row.
Delta variant is still spreading rapidly across many areas of the country.
Dr. Francis Collins, director of the National Institutes of Health, told Fox he is worried that Labor Day travel and gatherings could make it worse.
And if you're unvaccinated, boy, that virus is looking for you, and you don't want to be in a vulnerable place.
Hospitalizations have also surged again in many states, and deaths have also spiked. Nearly 11,000 last week, the most since early March.
Yeah, we're not doing very well, particularly in the Southeast, and that's because Delta is so contagious. It's ripping through the part of the adult population that has no immunity.
Dr. Marty Makary is a professor at Johns Hopkins University and a Fox News contributor.
That segment of the population, which is about 10 to 15% of all adults nationwide, but it's 20 to 30% of adults in parts of the Southeast where we've got very low vaccination rates. It is ripping very quickly through those communities. And it may be a bit of a boom and bust. We could see a rapid decline, but right now, the death toll is pretty high. About 1,500 Americans are dying each day, and they are adults without natural or vaccinated immunity. So if you're in that group, that's the group right now I would urge you to go and get at least one dose of the vaccine right away and to try to do it today.
People were talking about the Delta variant earlier in the summer, but we know we had, 4th of July came, we had cases were low. There was nobody really warning that we would be back to January levels with infections. I mean, did this surprise you?
You know, I think all of us in public health who have been talking about COVID have been wrong on a couple of things, right? We've all done our best, and nobody saw India happening. Not a single expert had seen the massive epidemic in India happening as late as it happened this summer. And then out of that emerged a strain that we didn't really understand, and that was Delta. And now we're seeing just how contagious it is. And it's really almost impossible to avoid it. The old principles of herd immunity don't apply to Delta. Delta has been a game changer. And so that's why I'd encourage everybody who does not have immunity to go out and get a vaccine dose.
But what about those who do have immunity, those who have been vaccinated? There have been breakthrough cases, and we hear them every day.
So we probably made a mistake, Dave, when we recommended the first 2 doses of the vaccine be 3 and 4 weeks apart. And in general, with any vaccine, the longer you space out the doses, the better the immune protection. And so I took my second dose at 3 months. Turns out the studies show that your immunity is at least 3 times better if you did that. And so now we're recognizing if you get if you had 2 doses close together, it kind of functioned as 1 dose, and you may need a second dose. That's what the data from Israel is suggesting.
Now, Israel is helping the U.S. next week. They're going to be working with the FDA on boosters. That's next. I mean, sometime later this month, the Pfizer booster will be available for Americans. I guess Moderna maybe a little bit later on. Do you recommend this 3rd dose?
For people over age 60, after you're about 6 months or 8 months out, it does show that it does reduce the rate of severe illness, the thing we really care about. I was not that concerned about mild breakthrough infections, but in people over 60, we are seeing an increase in severe illness after you get past 6 months. And it's probably just because those first 2 doses were too close together.
People who have been wary of the vaccine, don't believe in it, don't trust it, they use some of this changing information to their advantage to say, see this stuff, they don't know what they're talking about.
And adding to that confusion is that the government and public health leaders still ignore natural immunity. One of the most inexplicable scientific conclusions that you could ever have as a public health official is to look at all this overwhelming data showing now that natural immunity is 27 times better than vaccinated immunity, and to conclude, we're just going to require those to get vaccinated anyway. That lost a lot of credibility with public health leaders.
What about all those Americans who got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? Are they going to get a booster?
So given the broken FDA and the system that they have, we're probably going to hear about a booster recommendation for those who got the J&J vaccine a little bit later. And it will probably say, hey, you can have a Moderna or Pfizer, you can mix and match. We'll wait to see what the data truly shows, but that's what many of us believe.
There's yet another coronavirus mutation that's getting some attention, the Mu variant. It's not nearly as prevalent as Delta, but Biden advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci told CBS Face the Nation
it has a constellation of mutations that would indicate that it might evade the protection from certain antibodies.
But Dr. Makary is not worried about Mu.
And the reason is that each new variant, in order for it to compete with the existing variants, it has to be a lot more what we call fit or contagious. And there's no evidence right now that it's able to penetrate the sort of market share that Delta has. So Delta will likely be the dominant variant for a while. And even if Mu does populate the number of infections, it does not appear to have any property whereby it's evades your body's natural immunity, which is an important factor.
Okay. And so Delta so far is the strongest one.
Yeah, and that's why we're seeing such a severe wave right now, sweeping through Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, much of the Southwest, is that it's so much more contagious than we really thought. Now, you heard initially Delta might be, say, 20 to 30% more contagious than 40 to 60. Turns out it's at least twice as contagious as the prior very contagious UK strain.
All right. Schools are back in more and more places now after Labor Day. And the mask fight varying, it depends on what state you're in, Republicans, Democrats, all this. It's a back and forth we go. Masks, how effective are they really?
So a big randomized control trial was just completed. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal suggesting there could be some downsides to masks, and we should think twice before having mask mandates in areas where there's no active outbreak or with kids with disabilities. Since then, there's been some data, and that randomized control trial found zero benefit of cloth masks, a real benefit of surgical masks, and a significant benefit for KN95 masks, which are a little difficult to wear. But that's new data. So if you look at what's happening, this virus is so contagious, even in schools where there's universal masking, you're still seeing massive outbreaks and closures. We've got 1,000 schools in the United States now that have closed since the beginning of school this year. Many of them have had mask mandates. I think the conclusion is that we cannot rely on these masks to really, especially cloth masks, to mitigate outbreaks.
We did, though, hear for so long that, it's not really a factor. Kids don't really get sick. But hospitalizations with this new wave for children have risen quite a bit, have they not?
Absolutely. There are 52 million kids in the U.S. are school-aged children, and upwards of 25 to 27 million of them have had COVID now, most asymptomatic, and thank goodness they do develop natural immunity. But it is one of these infections right now where we don't have good options. Schools don't have good options. And arguing over cloth masks is really not the right conversation. We can't put each kid in their own private international space station during the pandemic. They need to interact. They need to see faces of other people. And I don't know what a good solution is right now for schools that are wrestling with the outbreaks.
Yeah, because what do? You have a lot of kids and you have a lot of nervousness. And then, if you don't shut them, then it spreads even more potentially. It's a difficult decision, is it not?
It's very challenging. I will say that one thing that schools should consider is to stop quarantining kids that may have been exposed, because that's what's resulting in a lot of the closures right now. We can't quarantine all of society because COVID is becoming endemic. That means it's everywhere. If you test 100 people in America right now that are asymptomatic, probably 10 or 15 are going to test positive, even though it may be a very low viral load and cannot make people sick. So we need to recognize that we've got to find a rhythm to learn to live with COVID while at the same time protecting those that may have risk factors.
There's something else controversial. Yet another COVID treatment that some who are not vaccinated have been touting. Ivermectin, an antiparasite drug used to deworm animals. The FDA has urged people not to take it, saying, "You're not a horse or a cow." But there is also a version of ivermectin approved for humans, and some suggested it shows promise treating COVID. But one doctor who called it a miracle drug at a Senate hearing has since backed off that claim. There was also misinformation recently that calls to poison control had soared, and emergency rooms in Oklahoma were full of people who had taken ivermectin. So what does Dr. Makary think?
Well, unfortunately, it's become a symbol of what's wrong with our national dialogue right now. Here's a drug that has been suggested to have antiviral properties. Some studies have hinted at a slight benefit. It's not going to save your life, I don't think, but there may be a slight benefit from the potential antiviral properties. But because it's been so demonized after the hydroxychloroquine wars, where people held on to that form of treatment, even after the studies showed there was no benefit. And that was pretty conclusive, that hydroxychloroquine just does not have activity. It doesn't affect the virus or its replication. After that, we've gotten in this mode now where anybody who suggests that ivermectin may be interesting, maybe there should be another study, or maybe it's worth trying because it's a lot safer than hydroxychloroquine, they're immediately getting demonized. I'm personally not recommending it at this time. But I will say this, Dave, there is a false sense of security among those who have chosen not to get the vaccine that, if I get COVID, ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and Regeneron will save my life. Therefore, I'm not going to worry about getting the vaccine. And that is a feeling, that is a regret for many of the 1,500 people who are dying each day on a ventilator in the United States. And if I could share, with listeners out there, not being able to breathe in an ICU is the worst feeling patients have ever described to me. And it's not something it's not a situation you ever want to have to struggle with.
And more people who don't have underlying conditions are getting themselves in that situation in hospitals who are younger than it used to be like a year ago. Is that correct?
That's right. And I wish the CDC put out really good data showing that it's still hard for this virus to hurt someone who's entirely healthy and young. And those who are a little older, even 35, 45 years of age, are at risk of hospitalization and severe illness. And when you add a risk factor to that, you're introducing a real risk of dying of COVID. Look, if there was a swimming pool and I told you, hey, there might be a shark in that pool and there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that shark will eat you, you'd probably avoid the swimming pool. And
yes, I would.
Risk appeals to some people, and it's not something I'll tell you people feel good about when they're sick in the hospital.
Dr. Marty Makary, professor at Johns Hopkins University. Always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Dave.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. Subscribe and listen to the Trey Gowdy Podcast. Former federal prosecutor and 4-term U.S. Congressman from South Carolina brings you a one-of-a-kind podcast. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Jimmy Fallon.
What's on your mind?
So here's a story that's making headlines as we head back to school and work this week. Dr. Anthony Fauci says he's keeping an eye on a new COVID variant that could evolve to be more dangerous, but seems okay at the moment. Like, is it me, or is breaking news actually broken? If this new variant seems okay, there's no reason to tell us about it. The breaking news is nothing happened, but something could? For one, that's not news, that's straight up fear-mongering. And two, we don't need a new name for every reboot like it's the Fast and the Furious. Think about it. Even when it mutates, COVID is still COVID. But make no mistake about it, TV-hungry guys like Dr. Fauci know that every new spinoff is a chance to attract more eyeballs. The only problem is this brazen scare tactic is becoming really hard to watch, which is why if Dr. Fauci really wanted to help the country, he'd let a new director take over the movie. Think about it, Doc. You've been on TV so much the last 2 years, they'd definitely have you on Dancing with the Stars. Or better yet, The Masked Singer. I'm Jimmy Fallon.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From the Fox News Podcasts Network. Stay on top of the latest news and information from Fox News. Listen and download the Fox News Hourly Update on your time. The trending stories you need anytime you want it. Listen and download now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.